Hey folks, good morning. Hope you're having a good Thanksgiving break. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Tariff of Abominations, the Bank War, and the Specie Circular. I'm going to do it quickly, so I'll stop in between each one and give you some keywords and things to remember. All right, number one, the Tariff of Abominations. You just watch a short video of it that it's simplified, but I think explains it well. The nuts and the bolts that you need to know is that Southerners hated tariffs because it helped the North but made goods that they were purchasing more expensive. So they felt that these were laws that were benefiting the North at the expense of the South. And the American system was the first tariff. It was a 15% tariff on all foreign goods that had been in place since 1816. But in 1828, Congress passed a law that proposed raising it to 25%. And in the next few years, they were passing laws to raise it even more, up to 45% on some goods. We see a tariff being raised. So in 1828, the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun, writes a pamphlet in his state of South Carolina. I like Thomas Paine's pamphlet before. And this pamphlet laid out was known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. The South Carolina Exposition and Protest laid out this idea known as the doctrine of nullification. Not a new idea. You saw it with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions before. But first time we see this expressed written idea that states should nullify what they consider to be unreasonable laws. So a lot like we saw with Adams, President of the United States, his Vice President, Thomas Jefferson, was actually getting states to disobey the Alien Sedition Acts. Here we see the same thing happening with John C. Calhoun getting his state, the state of South Carolina, to nullify or refuse to obey the federal tariff, the doctrine of nullification. So even though Calhoun printed this pamphlet without putting his name on it, it was known who had actually written the pamphlet. And Jackson lets it be known at a Jefferson Day dinner in 1830 on April 13th, where he lambasted the idea that states can disobey federal laws. And he has this phrase at the end of his speech where he says, "Our Union, it must be preserved." John C. Calhoun gets up later, gives another speech, and at the end of it he says, "Our Union, next to liberty, most dear." So the idea that liberty, which is more important than the Union, and tariff, or this Tariff of Abominations, as the South called it, was restricting the liberty of the South. Okay, so how does all this play out? So Jackson and Calhoun have a public split. Calhoun does not run in 1832 with Jackson as his vice president. Martin Van Buren does. Jackson is going to enforce the law of the land and not allow South Carolina to get away with not paying the tariff. So he gets Congress in 1833 to pass a force bill, which gives him the power, like George Washington did with the Whiskey Rebellion, to go down into South Carolina and force them to obey this tariff. Before he sends any troops, who steps in? Henry Clay. And as you saw in the video, Henry Clay gets Congress to pass a compromise tariff, which lowers the tariff back down to 25% when it had risen to 45%, ending the Tariff of Abominations crisis, but not ending the divide between the North and the South. Okay, so let's talk about the Bank War. The Second Bank of the United States had been passed as part of the American system in 1816 and had a 20-year sunset on it. So it needed to be rechartered before 1836 or it would disappear. Henry Clay was going to run for president in 1832 against Jackson. As a member of Congress, he wanted to make the Bank of the United States a major political issue in the campaign. So he pressed Congress to push forth a rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States in 1832, so that Jackson would have to come out for or against, and he could use his veto or support of the bank against him in this election. As you read in the book, Jackson hated the national bank. He thought it favored the rich over the poor. He thought it was favoring Northerners over the Southerners. He saw it as a hydra of corruption. And Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the bank, was a political enemy of Jackson. And Jackson said, "The bank's trying to kill me, I'll kill it." And so what he did was he passed an executive order that took all tax dollars coming into the federal government and stopped distributing to the national bank and put them in smaller pet banks that were chartered by the states. These pet banks had been created by the states in years before. Many of them had been created during the small lull in between 1811 and 1815 when there was no national bank. So these pet banks were smaller banks, they were state banks, and they would give loans to small investors rather than just the big corporations in the Northeast. But these banks also gave out bad loans. And many of the loans that they gave out led to massive speculation, the rise of the price of government land as people wanted to buy more and more land and were able to get more and more loans to do so. Unfortunately, many of the loans they were giving out were not backed up with hard currency or specie in the state banks. Because these banks had given out these bad loans, Jackson now felt he needed to do something to curb the wild speculation that had occurred. So he passed something known as the Specie Circular, which requires that federal government land only be bought in specie, specie being actual coins of gold. So just like before the Great Depression in the 1920s, these banks started calling on their loans, and this caused people to try to sell their loans, but they couldn't get what they originally paid for it. And therefore, prices of government land plummeted, and people had to default on their loans, causing these banks to fail. And with these banks now failing, this is government money lost, and there's no more money to be loaned out. And thus, the Specie Circular and Jackson's pet bank policy led to the Panic of 1837 and an economic depression. In addition to killing the national bank, which was one of his goals, the effects of this bank war and the Specie Circular were Martin Van Buren, who was now president in the year 1837 after Jackson had left, was the one who had to face this economic crisis and was blamed for it, and he was known as Martin Van Ruin to many people. And the bank war caused a split again, and a new party was formed known as the Whig Party in 1833 by Webster and by Clay, who opposed the pet bank policy and opposed many of Jackson's policies concerning roads, internal improvements, and his opposition to the national bank. All right, that's it. So, take this quiz. Good luck. And oh yeah, the secret word is boondoggle. Once again, the secret word is boondoggle. It'll help you on the quiz. Thanks for watching the whole thing. Peace.